We thank the second opposition speaker and call the proposition whip.
Can you hear me from the back? Okay, my name is Marvin. Before I move on to the points that actually matter, let's just deal with the 2 points coming from the side of opposition. Firstly, they talk about the representation of the minority. First and foremost, I want to talk about how in the countries like Europe, the far-right movements are often anti-minorities to begin with. In those particular instances, if minority interests are so important to you, are you going to allow them to propagate their views? Are you going to let them run for elections? And are you going to let them have the possibility of being in power and enact policies that will harm those very minorities that you're talking about? But secondly, even if they belong to the minority and the context that I'm going to challenge later, even if they are the minority, think about it. If you are already, if the population is already so indifferent towards you, and now you're going to run on a platform that is uncompromising, that you are going all the way to the end of the spectrum, how are you going to have policies that are going to be made on compromise with the rest of the population? The population will be thinking, if we go with your side, that means we are going with the extreme side of things. Most moderates will not lend support to this. So as a result of that, the minorities' interests will not be protected. But the concession coming from side opposition is this, is that we want to protect the middle ground at the end of the day, right? And the question is, if you allow for these political parties to come and to campaign and to run for elections, do you honestly think that the environment in parliament is necessarily one that has a middle ground and not, or is it going to be radicalized? And I'm going to explain this later in the points that actually matter, the 3 points of contention. On the second level, right, let's just deal with the main point of substantive, second of substantive. Firstly, you talk about transparency. Actually, I don't really see where's the transparency under their policy. But this is what they say. They say that, look, if you give them certain concessions, they will become closer to you, the exact word coming from opposition. And then they use the very same example of terrorist groups. My question to you is that if the US government is going to engage Al-Qaeda, do you think that Al-Qaeda will start to become closer to the US? Or do you think that it will be seen as a concession, as a sign of weakness on the side of the United States government, and it's going to embolden them, and it's going to strengthen their rhetoric, that this is a party that is able to hold up its own against the government and concessions are being made. But then they use the second tier, right? And they say, oh, but the good thing is this, is that if you engage them in the political process, then they won't do anything that is radical. That is not true. If you take a look at the Sinn Féin party, right, even while it's engaging in political negotiations with the British government, what actually happened is that it also has a paramilitary wing out there who is wreaking havoc and violence that is taking to begin with. Your fundamental assumption doesn't even hold true to begin with. 3 main points of contention in today's debate. On the first level, why are they so problematic? Secondly, what are the concrete harms of these far-right political parties? And last but not least, why on earth are we interfering with the electoral process? Why are we interfering with diversity? Don't we trust voters? So let's first ask the first question, the characterization of the problem. Why are they so problematic? You see, the thing is this, there is a distinction between right-wing parties and far-right-wing parties. There's a reason why they even run on this platform to begin with. For example, the Islamists, like for example the Salafists in Egypt, the reason why they even begin on a far-right platform is because they portray themselves as this group of people who is reverting back to the culture as well as the traditions of the people to begin with. This is especially problematic because at the end of the day, we always hope that political process is going to modernize and going to cause parties to be more reasonable and moderate. But if these parties started off with defending the purist ideas, it's highly unlikely they're going to make concessions. It's highly unlikely they are going to make compromises, which is why the first bigger point is so important. That is the reason why they are often a roadblock to many of the moderate policies that we want to run to begin with. But on the second level, why don't they change? Why are they so problematic? It's because it's a vicious cycle, right? The group of supporters that support far-right people are often very radical and often very extremist to begin with. So for this group of people or these parties to continue to be in power, they have to meet up with the expectations of what their supporters have to begin with. This is the reason why they are almost always locked in their particular position. So on the second issue, right, what are the exact harms of these far-right political parties? I'm just going to consolidate the case of such proposition. On the first level, we talk about how it blocks the constructive process For example, in the United States of America, the rising up of the Tea Party has caused the Republican parties to shift more right than it originally is. And already we see the deadlock that is taking place between the Democrats and the Republicans. If we see that Republicans are becoming more and more uncompromising, we say that policies that is constructive, both for the minorities and the majority, will not take place. On the other level, another very good example is the issue of Israel, right? Like Israel has a diversity of people, both like the Jews as well as the Palestinian population to begin with. What has actually happened is that in these countries, in Israel for example, no thank you, what happened was these far-right parties are trying to hijack the political platform, which is the reason why Benjamin Netanyahu, on one hand, he wants to solve the Palestinian question and have a peace process being driven forward, but on the other hand, he's afraid that the coalition government that supports him is not going to support him anymore, precisely because the far-right parties are accusing him of betraying the very fundamental national interest of these particular parties. This is yet another instance of concrete policies being blocked to begin with. On the third level, let's talk about the minorities. Why is it that minorities will feel so hurt under when far-right parties are in power, or they are in power of the coalition government, or even if they are not in power, they are part of the political campaigns? It's because at the end of the day, like sometimes when there's a particular political party running for power, the rhetoric, they make certain arguments, you can reasonably engage with it on a logical level. But if one political party says that like this is how things should be, this is how you become a citizen of this country, and so on and so forth, because they are very strong on affirming certain particular national identities. These are minorities cannot adapt to this kind of logical reasoning process to begin with. And on the fourth level, we also say that in terms of international engagement, in the event whereby these far-right parties become more and more predominant, it's highly unlikely that, for example, the US is going to work with Egypt that has the Salafists in power to begin with, right? Because at the end of the day, there is still a fundamental level of distrust that these sort of political decisions are made based on like pre-existing like nationalistic values rather than a logical discourse to begin with. Last question, the interference with the electoral process. Why are we doing this? Let's first understand that there is a pressing need to do so to begin with. Because under their policy, they say, let's only intervene when people are dying. But my question in the POI, right, is that if you are able to rewind history and to stop the Nazi party from coming to power, we would do so, right? Because at the end of the day, by the time you realize that they are so harmful, people will already have died. By the time you realize that they are so powerful, they will have already like usurped the nationalistic propaganda. They will already usurp the state machinery, like for example the secret police, to quash the particular opposition. By the time the people realize it is far too late, which is why we need an insurance program over here to protect the people from these kind of leaders. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
We thank the proposition whip, and we call the opposition whip.
The reason why we have a democracy, the reason why we vote, is exactly because we can't tell the future and we can't look at things today as if we can already tell the outcome. Given this, Mr. Speaker, we have to respect that individuals and their votes matter, and that's why we need to allow all or the widest range of people to run for us to have informed decisions. There are two issues in this debate that I want to look at. Firstly, what is the role of a democracy? And second, is it more harmful to allow the far right to run? First issue. The thing that they want to tell us is the idea that the point of the democracy and its role is to represent the minority. What they told us were a number of things, that political parties should espouse flexible views, that a lot of progressive policies aren't being passed because of the far right. I have three major responses. Firstly, we would say that the far right is in itself a minority. And we think that given this is a truth, this is a principal contradiction to their principle, the idea that we ought to respect the minority. In fact, what we would say is this, that the far right is in fact anti-majority. They are the ones who are, for example, against the blacks, against women, against rights, which we think in modern times are major views, as contradictory it might seem.
On this then.
Second of all, we would say that the far left, the left, and even the moderates have very stern views that are often very resistant to change. We think that the flexibility that they're talking about, the idea where people condense their views or begin to reconsider their views, happens and occurs during campaigns and post-election evaluation. It's when these people run and when these people fail that they begin to decide maybe the views that we are forwarding are not okay, maybe we should change them. The problem with their side is that when you remove them from the democracy and you allow them to keep thinking in their own heads that their view is right, that is where you don't get flexibility anyway. In fact, if you look at it, the liberals, right, they're very liberal and progressionist, right? You could say that in one way, they don't change their views as well. If their standard is changing of views, we would say liberals are just as stern, and under their standards, we would not allow even the far left, or even the moderates to run in themselves. Thirdly, if the far right has effectively blocked legislation, I want to say three things. Firstly, it reveals the strength of the view, that maybe people do believe it, that maybe even if they are far right, that some things that they are forwarding are indeed acceptable. Second of all, more importantly, we would say it's probably not true. There are a lot of progressionist policies, for example, that forward gay rights that are not necessarily being blocked only by the far right. Many moderates, for example, are not okay with gay rights. Many people in the right, but not the far right, are not okay with gay rights. Are you saying that all these people's views are not okay? And are you saying that you now have a monopoly of objectivity and what is right? Please be seated. Thirdly, in response to the POI, and again, let's resolve this issue. We don't have the power of fortune telling. That's why the idea about what if we could go back to the past and analyze the Holocaust again, would we have allowed it to happen? Sit down. We think this is not a fair question to ask because back then, at the time they were making those decisions, they didn't have the foresight to understand that maybe Hitler was wrong. Maybe he's just so influential. Maybe there is no value or moral value. The example we want to look at, for example, is the Iraq War. The Iraq War was not raised necessarily by the far right. In fact, it may have been raised just by the right or even a number of moderates. But we think, Mr. Speaker, this was a mistake that we think we could not have foretold. We could not have necessarily told ourselves and been certain that there are no nuclear weapons there, that there is no value in invading. So the point is, people make mistakes, but this does not mean we remove them from the entire policy because we think that there are a number of harms in that. Sit down. Second, they tell us that there are benefits of the far right that aren't mutually exclusive to their views. And this is the reason why democracies don't need to put them in or calculate them in. First of all, democracy is not a utilitarian competition of benefits. It's not about a competition of which political party has more benefits. I'm just going to vote based on that. We think that political ideologies are not just merely lists and numbers. Second of all, what about the benefit of democracy, right? The idea that you're not allowing people to run is a mutually exclusive benefit that is lost on your side because you are telling some individuals have the right to speak, some individuals don't have the right to speak. Before I move on, yes.
Do you think that discrimination is a legitimate opinion? Because if that's the case, will you stand for anti-discrimination laws? Yes or no?
No, discrimination is not okay, but for a lot of conservative people, for example, allowing gay rights is discrimination against their views. And while we think that's not okay in itself, we think people should talk about it and come to a conclusion then. The belief and the act are two fundamentally different things, and we think your yes and no questions don't simply resolve how difficult the political realities are. Sit down. No. Second issue, is it more harmful? Firstly, what they told us is that granting them legitimacy is in itself harmful. Three responses. Firstly, allowing them to run doesn't necessarily grant status. What do we grant them? We tell them, you are a political party, you can run, you can win, you can lose. This is the same thing we do with religion. We allow them to form, we allow them to conglomerate. This does not mean that just because we allow Catholics to conglomerate, that necessarily we support the religious view. In fact, by allowing many religions or many political parties, that dilutes the idea that we are supporting one particular group. Second, this is a contradiction that they're raising because they told us we don't want them to run, but we're okay with them spreading their views. Mr. Speaker, if you're okay with them spreading their views, then you are granting them legitimacy through media, through universities, through education, and the academe. We think this is a contradiction on your side. Third of all, we think that allowing them to participate in politics grants us the opportunity to delegitimize their views where they don't have the monopoly of influence. In their own social spheres, right, where we don't have politics, where we don't have objective and critical people trying to analyze what these guys are forwarding, it's so easy for them to influence the masses. But in politics, exactly what they were talking about, when we interview them on CNN, when they are up for public debates, that's where we can expose, Mr. Speaker, their flaws. That's where we can tell them where we think they are wrong and where they're not going to be winning. Second, they tell us that there's a harm in them of possibly winning. First of all, this is a very speculative and minority report type of argument. It's possible they could do harm, but Mr. Speaker, we don't penalize people who could possibly do harm. We penalize people who actually do harm. So until they own a majority of a government and until, Mr. Speaker, they violate the Constitution, we think we ought to give them the benefit of the doubt. Second of all, if they don't moderate, Mr. Speaker, there's virtually no way of winning anyway. Even Republicans and liberals often have to moderate their views to garner more votes. You lose this benefit when you remove them from the political spectrum. Finally, what we told you, Mr. Speaker, is that the problem with moral blindness or people being bigoted is when they are left isolated. Your policy does this more. They raise examples about Iraq and about Israel and Palestine, about how, for example, what we have done is allow the far right to influence them. The question we have to ask is, if we remove them from the equation, how would it have made the situation better? For all these reasons, we're very proud of it.
We thank the opposition whip. We now move on to the replies in this debate. We first have the opposition reply.
Mr. Speaker, two simple reasons why the government cannot win this debate today. First thing, they wanted to respect and satisfy the majority and at the same time not exclude the minority. That was the exact justification why they wanted to kick out these far-right parties, which they've actually proven, we've proven throughout the debate, that that was their methodology of dealing with this problem. We think that was bad. Second reason why they lose is they've never proven the procedures as to why these political domination and the dangers that these guys were so worried and skeptical about will happen at the end of the day. We told you, first thing, that possibility cannot win debates. You need to prove the procedural and justifications as to why your dangers will actually materialize and will actually happen at the end of the day. Second reason why we told you is it's so easy to say that, you know what, well, there was going to be an earthquake in Japan, therefore I wouldn't have gone to Japan. In the hindsight, right? When we look at it back, everything is obvious, Mr. Speaker. We don't think there was enough justification for the government to say, looking back, we could have prevented so many things. Well, unless you have a time machine, we don't think they can win this debate today. Second reason why we told you, actually I'm going to divide our side into three different levels of why we've given our burden of proof and why we've done our job. First thing we told you is this idea of political empowerment. Why is it uniquely important that we do give them political voice in order to dilute, in order to invite them to the political table, to make sure that we minimize the potential harms that they were worried about. Second of all, we told you was the value of democracy. You do not have justification to simply kick these guys out, and that's what we've done for you. So first issue. How did we tell you that political empowerment was especially important? We told you as soon as you give them political empowerment and political position, you need to play by the rules of democracy. You cannot institutionalize radical things like murder. You cannot institutionalize radical things without passing the Congress, without passing the voters, Mr. Speaker. Second thing, we also told you that we're not worried about political domination because we think the society is simply smart enough to have that social stigma against stupid ideas and bad values, Mr. Speaker. We also told you that you cannot simply arbitrarily tell these guys that you will never be good enough for our society, therefore we're going to exclude you forever. The response we got from the government side was that wouldn't it be a weak image with government if we engage with them suddenly like we do in KIDA. Mr. Speaker, we think this actually line was misdrawn because just because the government doesn't engage with them and kick them out, that doesn't necessarily strengthen the image of the government. It simply tells them we cannot deal with this headaching people, therefore our solution is to kick them out and hope things will be better. Mr. Speaker, that's not a solution. And the last thing they told you is this idea of Palestinian government and the Iraqi war. Well, funny thing, they said this debate in liberal democracy, that all their analysis comes from non-democratic countries. We don't think that analysis was valid. Second of all, who or which side best respects the value of democracy? They told you that we want to prevent the harms. We already told you numerous times that that's not justified. Second of all, they told you that exclusivity and stubbornness is not good enough. Exactly the reason why I wanted to bring these guys to the political table to talk about the issues. We told you the very idea of dialogue between different ideas is important. That sometimes you simply agree to disagree and accept that that's just the way it is. Mr. Speaker. We also told you that you guys are not asking these guys to compromise and middle ground. You guys are asking these people to conform to your ideas. Probably the reason why they're not successfully, communicating with these guys in status quo. For those, So what we've told you on the opposition side is basically that you cannot say possibility is a solution to everything. Denial is very, very bad. We think engagement is the way to go. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
And now just the proposition replies to close this debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, if probability could not win debates, half the debates that happen around the world would not happen. What we tell you on this side of the house is that in a situation such as this, in a situation wherein you're determining what kind of government is going to be best for a country which is so inherently diverse, wherein there are so many people who are at the threat of losing out on their interests because of certain policies propagated by certain people, you have to weigh the probability and you have to see what kind of government will best function and best serve the interests of all these people, right? Before I move on to anything else, that was the definition of new matter in a whip speech. Adjudicators, please take note. Besides that, contradictions that need to be pointed out and were pointed out in their speech. Things like the radical or the far-right parties are themselves minorities. Something that we never claimed from the start. We simply claimed that they are grounded in a certain ideology of a community. However, we did engage with that and gave you scenarios wherein they might be minorities or majorities. They both don't serve the purpose of the interest of the rest of the community, right? How did we do this? We told you that in case they're majorities, their policies are going to be centered only around the majority population, and minorities will obviously be left out. In the case that there are minorities, they because of the Puritan views that they espouse and because of the radical frame of mind that they come from, they will want to create as much of a roadblock as possible for passing of policies which will cater to the rest of the population. Again, something that we see as a problem. Again, in accordance with the fact that they might also take this to mean a weakening of the government in its entirety if they do take their views into consideration. With respect to everything that they said with regard to political voice and how it's important to grant these communities political voice also, we simply come up to you and ask you that if their views and if their opinions are so valid, why can they not be sponged in by all other political parties that exist also? We came up to you and asked you that other political parties which are liberal and want to accommodate these other political views will do that as well and forward the cause of these communities if their cause is valid. But if their cause propagates things like we must go around killing everybody who's black or we must discriminate against Muslims or homosexuals, we tell you that it's wrong to grant any kind of voice to these communities in the beginning in itself, right? To this their response is that you don't know how society is going to pan out and what the legitimacy of this political party is going to be somewhere down the line. Well, very simply, we've learned from the past, haven't we? If you say that societies will automatically change with regard to the social stigma that they've experienced in the past, or that society is smart enough to make these kind of decisions, then why do you still have supporters for white supremacists? Why do you still have supporters for religious parties and all of that? Clearly the Holocaust wasn't enough to make you realize that this is wrong and radical parties should not exist. Which is why a move needs to be taken, which is why a step needs to be taken to make sure that this kind of a situation doesn't arise again. Because people still support these parties and we see some kind of harm which might happen in the future because people haven't learned from history, and that's something that's a problem for us, right? So you can't simply come up to us and tell us that every situation is different and you can't judge anything on the basis of what happened on the past because you're supposed to learn from past mistakes in the first place, right? With regard to conformity versus diversity, we tell you that we are protecting diversity in all its forms. We're not cutting out on any view, and it's extremely trivial for them to come up and say that you are cutting out on view because simply because you're not allowing for any kind of political representation and all of that. We tell you that you can go ahead and propagate your views if you want to. However, there's a problem if your views are posing a problem to the rest of the political scenario that exists or to the rest of the population that exists. We believe that the rights of those minorities besides yourself or those communities besides yourself need also to be protected, especially when they are at risk of your views going against them so directly or your interests harming their interests so directly. So we tell you that we are protecting diversity in all its form. Given the situation that we are in, given the context that we are in, something that they didn't realize right from the start, something that they didn't engage with us right from the start, right? We tell you that we are debating this in a context wherein there is a pressing need for this kind of move to be taken, wherein we see a situation that sees various interest groups at a risk of discrimination because of such policies and because of such parties existing in the first place. We tell you a free market of ideas will not naturally weed out such political parties because it hasn't happened in the past and it doesn't seem to be happening anywhere in the future. We tell you that all the threshold for harm arguments that they made, saying that you can only take an action when there is a harm cause, are fallacious right from the start, and for all those reasons I'm very proud.